Welcome back. As always, today we talk about things that nobody really asked for, but you'll be glad we did. Today's topic, the food pyramid. The one built by aliens. Wait, sorry. That's the Egyptian ones. But we'll get into that on another episode. You remember those colorful triangles from your elementary school cafeteria? The ones that told you eat 11 servings of bread a day? Yeah. What was that about? Was it science? Was it nutrition? Or was it conspiracy? Spoiler alert, it might have been big bread, big dairy, and or big beef pulling the strings. And here's the twist. RFK Jr., the new HHS secretary, just released his own version of the food pyramid, and it looks nothing like the one we grew up with. So, what changed? Why did the food pyramid exist in the first place, and who really benefits from these guidelines? Grab your tinfoil hats and maybe a baguette, because we're about to dive deep. Before we begin, I have a quick disclaimer. The intent of this podcast is to remain politically neutral and to encourage critical thinking and open discussion. Any criticism made is not partisan. I'm an equal opportunity hater and I don't align myself with any political side on this podcast. Questioning ideas is the goal, not pushing beliefs. Additionally, I am not a medical doctor or a healthcare professional, and nothing discussed on this podcast should be interpreted as medical fact. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Always consult a qualified professional regarding medical or health related matters. So, the food pyramid was released in 1992 by the USDA, which should already raise a flag, right? Red flags. Because why would the Department of Agriculture be involved in a health related initiative? Is that not an HHS topic? The part of the government that was literally created to keep us healthy and to keep healthcare costs down. But anyway, at the base of this pyramid, bread, cereal, rice, and pasta. 6 to 11 servings a day. That's right, 11 servings of carbs a day. Above that were fruits and vegetables, 2 to 4 servings, then meats and dairy, both at 2 to 3 servings a day. And at the very top, fats and sweets labeled, quote, use sparingly with no recommended serving size. Basically, the pyramid told us to eat like we were carbo loading for a marathon every single day. And we believed it. Schools plastered it on cafeteria walls, health classes drilled it into our heads, and it became the gospel of nutrition for an entire generation. Now, parents and especially children in the 90s into the early 2000s didn't have access to resources we have now, so we can't place all the blame on them. But in the 90s, for those of you old enough to remember them, congrats. I would consider you my elder. Make sure you keep that, what is that? Aceto.
Said, well, let's see how we say that.
I've got it. Acetaminophen. Keep that acetaminophen close by for all the back pain I'm sure you have. But anyway, my existence wasn't even a thought, let alone to be able to recall this time. So when both parents and children read cereal at the bottom of this food pyramid, without looking it up, even I would have assumed that we were talking about Fruit Loops, Cinnamon Toast Crunch, or Pops. Okay, quick sidebar before we continue. Do you guys remember those weird freaking commercials for Pops cereal that were on TV? What was up with that? And how do you even spell Fruit Loops? Is it Fruit or Froot? Because apparently it has always been Froot, but I distinctly remember when it was Fruit. Could this be one of those Mandela effect things at work? Maybe. Maybe that'll have to be another niche topic that we'll talk about one day, but for now, let's get back to it. So, what the USDA was actually referring to are called cereal grains, which, for those of you who didn't Google them to sound smart for this podcast, cereal grains are the edible seeds of grasses. So, for example, oats, barley, corn, and rye. And then there are pseudo cereals like quinoa and buckwheat, which makes sense, right? Because the USDA oversees these types of products, so it's only natural that we eat boatloads of them. So essentially, no, the USDA was not telling us to eat 11 servings of sugar loaded cereal a day. But for the longest time, that's what the majority of Americans were doing. And maybe they still do. Maybe not to the extent of 11 servings a day, but who didn't grow up eating a sugar filled cereal before school or even at school in the morning? And if you didn't, congratulations, you probably had a bowl of sadness and oats for breakfast. Now, let's talk about big dairy because this one's interesting. I and most other Americans are obsessed with dairy. And maybe that is because of the USDA and their push to intake dairy on a daily basis. Humans are the only species on Earth that drink another species' milk. Dairy is a cultural food and not a biological requirement. Scientifically speaking, there is zero benefit that is derived from any dairy product that cannot be sourced through meat, vegetables, or other plant based alternatives. In fact, 65 to 70% of the world loses the ability to digest lactose after childhood. And this is normal for humans. The unnatural thing is for our body to be able to tolerate lactose as adults. So, why did the USDA tell us to be healthy that we need to drink or have 2 to 3 servings of dairy a day? Could it be because of the dairy lobby? I think we all remember the Got Milk campaign. I certainly do. It was on billboards, in grocery stores, inside the schools, everywhere. They preached to the schools and to the parents that milk is required for you to have good bones. And this has been proven false countless times. Epidemiological studies show that countries like the United States have an unnaturally large dairy intake and actually have the same or higher rates of bone fractures and breaks. Bone health actually depends on hormones, diet pattern, vitamin D status, and weight-bearing exercise. So, how did the how did dairy become such a vital part of our lives? And how did it get into the food pyramid? Okay. So here's what we know. The dairy industry funded nutrition research, influence guideline research, and framed dairy as essential for bones and the best source of calcium and necessary for children. And the government subsidizes dairy production, which led to the overproduction of dairy, so the government needed more people to consume dairy. Enter the Got Milk campaign and the school lunch program, which required a serving of milk. So now let's talk about the meat lobby. The original food pyramid called for 2 to 3 servings of meat, limited to 4 to 6 ounces. And the slogan, Eat Less Meat, was introduced. And the meat lobby was furious. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association, in combination with the North American Meat Institute, they retaliated. They lobbied Congress, they submit formal objections, and they applied pressure to the USDA directly. In that new food pyramid, the meat lobby funded research, and the USDA balanced Americans' health with farm economics because the United States produces massive amounts of animal proteins. And the science tells us that meat, like dairy, is optional. And this is why you don't see vegetarians and vegans dying on the street from their lack of meat intake. Excess meat intake has even been scientifically associated with cardiovascular disease risk and an increased risk of cancer with processed meat. Meat dominance has been fueled by agricultural subsidies, lobbying, and cultural norms that have already been established. I won't really go any further about the meat industry just because it's a societal norm, and despite the science saying that we can live without it, I choose to put my fingers in my ear and say la 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 like a child because I think steak is yummy and I love a good burger. Now, let's talk about the group that managed to stay the quietest while benefiting the most, and that's Big Bread. And when I say big bread, I don't mean your local bakery or the guy that was making sourdough during the pandemic. I'm talking about large scale grain producers, refined flour manufacturers, and food corporations built around wheat, corn, and processed grain products. Bread and grain producers were perfectly positioned when the food pyramid dropped. Putting grains at the base wasn't just a nutrition recommendation, it was a guaranteed demand engine. The USDA already subsidized grain production heavily, especially corn and wheat, which meant massive surpluses were already baked into the system. The pyramid didn't create that system, but it absolutely validated it. The problem wasn't telling people to eat grains. The problem was never clearly distinguishing between whole grains and refined grains in a way that mattered to the average person. When the pyramid said bread, it didn't say whole grain bread, and it didn't say minimally processed bread. It didn't say bread with fiber intact, and food companies filled that silence instantly. Refined flour products became the default: white bread, crackers, snack cakes, and pasta made from stripped down grains with fiber removed and vitamins added back in, and then sold as enriched. This wasn't accidental. Refined grains have a longer shelf life, they're cheaper, and are far more profitable at scale. Whole grains spoil faster and are harder to market consistently. So, Big Bread didn't need flashy campaigns like dairy, they didn't need slogans. They already won by default. They benefited from ambiguity, and that's when people started gaining weight and blood sugar issues arose. Grains as a category took the blame and not the processing. That distinction matters because modern nutrition science doesn't say that grains are bad. It says refined grains consumed in excess without fiber are bad. But culturally, bread became the villain while ultra processing escaped the spotlight. And here's where Big Bread's influence is in the modern era. As dietary guidance has shifted away from the old pyramid, refined grain producers, they didn't just disappear, they adapted. The labels changed, the marketing changed, and the products became whole grain adjacent without being meaningfully better. And we've all seen it. Bread that says made with whole grains instead of 100% whole grain. Cereals with a sprinkle of fiber added back in, and crackers with buzzwords instead of nutritional substance. Big Bread didn't fight the new science, they just learned how to dance around it. And modern guidelines now emphasize whole grains instead of refined grains, but enforcement is still non existent. The same companies that dominated the bottom of the old food pyramid still dominate shelf space today. The only difference is they've learned how to sound healthy while staying ultra processed. So while Big Bread didn't sit front and center in the conversation anymore, their influence hasn't gone away. It's just become quieter and more sophisticated. So now let's talk more about RFK's food pyramid because this is where things start to get interesting yet again. His proposed framework reflects a much closer alignment with modern nutritional science than the original USDA pyramid ever did. And RFK's model shifts the focus away from rigid serving counts and towards food quality. Whole foods take priority, and ultra processed foods are explicitly discouraged. Refined grains are no longer treated as a dietary foundation. Fiber, a metabolic health, and chronic disease prevention are clearly put as part of the conversation. That alone makes a massive improvement over the original pyramid. And it also removes the visual dominance of bread and grains. In the old pyramid, grains physically formed the base, implying that everything else depended on them. The new approach treats carbohydrates as a category that must be earned through quality and not quantity. That is a major philosophical shift. But here's the problem. Even RFK's updated model still relies on simplification. And simplification is where nutrition guidance always starts to crack. Humans don't eat pyramids, they eat environments. And no pyramid, no matter how well designed, can compete with a food system that's dominated by ultra processed convenience foods. And another issue is that the new model still assumes access to whole foods, fresh produce, and minimally processed proteins. And time to prepare meals is not universal. Guidelines can be scientifically sound and still fail if they don't account for the socioeconomic reality. And lastly, RFK's framework still exists within the same agricultural and economic system. Grain subsidies still exist, meat subsidies still exist, dairy subsidies still exist. So you can redraw the pyramid all you want, but if the incentives don't change, behavior won't either. So, yes, this new pyramid is better. It's much better, but it's not a solution. It's a step in the right direction, but it still fails to address the root cause, which is a food industry that's optimized for profit and not for health. Okay, so here's the baseline carbs are good for you, period. Carbs are proven to improve your gut health and feed into a beneficial gut microbiome and produce short chain fatty acids, which have been shown to reduce intestinal inflammation. It strengthens your gut barrier and lowers your risk for colon cancer. Carbs also help regulate your hormones and metabolism. Carbs can also preserve your muscle mass, And the carbs we hear are so bad for us are the refined carbs, not carbohydrates as a biological category. So, what is a good carb versus a bad carb? The good ones are foods like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, and potatoes or yams. The bad ones are the ultra refined sugars, the high processed starches, and excess liquid sugar like a Pepsi or a Coke. So, our body turns carbs into glucose, which in turn powers your body, right? Your brain needs glucose daily to operate optimally. Without sufficient carbs, your body has to seek other sources for energy, like protein, and it would be converted to glucose by a process called gluconeogenesis, which increases muscle breakdown, and your body begins to rely more heavily on stress hormones like cortisol and glucagon. The whole fad thing about your body in ketosis, dumb. The ketogenic diet was originally created to help epileptic children with their seizures, not to lose weight. It was developed in like the 1920s when doctors observed that fasting and greatly reducing the amount of carbs that a child would eat would force their body to use ketones instead of glucose to power their bodies. And that vastly reduced the number and severity of seizures for them. This practice slowly disappeared throughout the mid 20th century when anti seizure medication was released by what we now know as Big Pharma. Okay, so I've got another sidebar. Why did we switch from a natural solution to this problem that we already had to what Big Pharma was pushing us? What made that influence and what made that final decision? But maybe that's something we need to get to in another episode. But anyway, back to it. So, after the food pyramid quietly collapsed under its own weight of its own confusion, the government tried a rebrand. Out went the triangle and in came the plate. In 2011, the USDA introduced MyPlate, which was supposed to be simpler, clearer, and more modern. No more serving ranges, no more tiers, just a plate that was divided into sections. Fruits, vegetables, grains, protein, and dairy was hovering off to the side like it wasn't sure if it still belonged there. So, on the surface, my plate looked like progress. It emphasized fruits and vegetables more clearly, it reduced the visual dominance of grains, and it grouped protein sources together instead of spotlighting meat. But the problem wasn't the graphic. The problem was that my plate still avoided the hardest truths, and by doing so, repeated many of the same mistakes as the pyramid. My plate still refused to clearly distinguish between whole foods and ultra processed foods. A plate filled with whole grains and a plate filled with refined grains technically both satisfied the grains section. A protein section could be fish and beans or processed deli meat and fried nuggets, and my plate offered no real guidance on that difference. So the same ambiguity that allowed corporations to hijack the pyramid carried straight over to the plate. It also continued the tradition of pretending food exists outside of context. My plate assumed people had equal access to fresh produce, had the time to cook and the nutritional education, and grocery stores that weren't dominated by processed convenience foods. It didn't address desserts, it didn't address marketing, it didn't address portion distortion. It just assumed the environment would cooperate, even though the environment is the entire problem. And then there's dairy. My plate technically softened dairy's dominance, but it never really removed it. Dairy remained a recommended daily component despite the same biological realities still being true. Lactose intolerance remained normal, dairy remained optional, and yet the guidance stayed vague enough to keep milk cartons flowing through schools and subsidies untouched. Perhaps the biggest failure of my plate was that it solved the wrong problem. The food pyramid failed not because people couldn't understand it, but because it existed in a food system designed to exploit simple rules. My plate tried to simplify further instead of addressing that system. It changed the picture without changing the incentives. And culturally, my plate never stuck. It didn't become iconic like the pyramid we all know. Most of you, I'm sure, have never heard of my plate. So it didn't reshape behavior, it didn't undo decades of food marketing, and most people couldn't even tell you what my plate recommends beyond eat some veggies. It was quieter, it was less controversial, and it was easier to ignore. In a way, made it even less effective. So, while MyPlate was absolutely an improvement in design, it was still a failure in impact. It avoided confrontation with the industries, it avoided ultra processed foods as a core issue, and it avoided admitting that nutrition guidance cannot work without structural change. So, in other words, MyPlate wasn't wrong, it was just incomplete. And in a system this broken, incomplete guidance might as well be wrong. And let me just say this real quick. My plate was not a solution. It was just a rebrand. We didn't fix nutrition policy, we changed the shape. We went from a triangle to a circle and acted like we solved obesity. Incredible work, truly. I wouldn't expect anything less from the government. My plate didn't fail because people are dumb. It failed because it refused to say anything that was uncomfortable. It didn't tell you what foods to avoid, and it didn't tell you what ultra processed actually means. It didn't tell you that a chicken nugget from McDonald's and lentils are not the same thing just because they both count as protein. It just said, here's a plate, good luck, figure it out. And then there's dairy, still there, sitting off to the side like an airline baggage fee. You didn't ask for it, you didn't want it, but surprise, it's mandatory. You can technically fly without it, but the system keeps pretending you can't. MyPlate assumed people had unlimited access to fresh food, unlimited time to cook, and aren't being psychologically tackled by food marketing every 5 seconds. It ignored the environment entirely, and ignoring the environment is how every nutrition guideline quietly fails. So, no, my plate wasn't evil. It was worse. It was polite. And polite advice doesn't survive in a system designed to nickel and dime you at every corner. Now, before everyone starts screaming on social media, let's be clear about something. None of this means that the food pyramid was created with malicious intent. I don't think there was a secret meeting where all these corporations sat around a table, rubbing their hands together like a cartoon villain, deciding how to make Americans obese. What I think happened is far less dramatic and way more frustrating. The food pyramid was a result of compromise. Science, economics, politics, and industry all collided, and public health lost just enough for the damage to compound over decades. The pyramid was overly simplistic in a world that rewards exploitation. It said grains and not whole grains. It said use fats sparingly without explaining the difference between fats that support hormones and fats that clog arteries. It grouped protein together without clarifying that beans, lentils, nuts, fish, and meat all behave very differently in the body. So now we enter into the low fat era that absolutely wrecked us. When government messaging labeled fat as the enemy, food manufacturers responded by removing the fat and replacing it with sugar, starch, emulsifiers, and preservatives. But fat makes food satisfying. You remove it, and people eat more. Sugar spikes insulin and increases hunger and promotes fat storage. So we ended up with fat free cookies, low fat yogurts that had more sugar than ice cream, and breakfast cereals that were basically candy in a cardboard box with a cartoon mascot. Obesity rates didn't explode just because people became lazy and lacked willpower. They exploded because the food environment had changed. Type 2 diabetes didn't skyrocket because Americans forgot how to count calories. It skyrocketed because of ultra processed food, and it had become the norm, not the exception. The pyramid never accounted for food processing, metabolic health, or hormonal effects of what we eat. It treated food like math, but the human body responds to food like chemistry. So naturally, once people realized that following the pyramid and my plate made them heavier, sicker, and more tired, the pendulum swung hard in the opposite direction. Enter into the diet wars. Atkins, paleo, keto, carnivore. Suddenly carbs weren't just unhealthy, they were evil. Bread went from eat this constantly to this will kill you. And just like before, nuance disappeared. Here's the reality: low carb diets can work short term. People lose weight because they lose water, suppress appetite, and unintentionally eat fewer calories. But long term, chronically low carb diets increase stress hormones like cortisol. They reduce thyroid hormone activity. They decrease gut microbiome diversity and lower short chain fatty acid production and increase the likelihood of muscle loss if protein isn't meticulously managed. Your body can survive low carb states. It does not thrive there long term for most people. And this is where carbohydrates get unfairly blamed. Carbs are not the enemy. Refined carbs are the enemy. Fiber rich carbohydrates are one of the most important components of human health. Non digestible carbohydrates feed your gut bacteria, which ferment into the short chain fatty acids. These compounds reduce intestinal inflammation, strengthen your gut lining, and improve your insulin sensitivity. They even regulate immune function and lower your risk of colon cancer. You literally cannot get these benefits without eating carbohydrates. Carbohydrates also preserve your muscle mass by sparing protein, regulating hormones, and provide the most efficient fuel source for your brain. Your brain requires glucose to function optimally. And again, when carbs are insufficient, your body converts protein into glucose through gluconeogenesis, increasing muscle breakdown and placing greater demand on stress hormones like cortisol and glucagon. That's not optimization, that's survival mode. So, when people say carbs are unnecessary, what they really mean is that you can survive without them. But you can also survive on 5 hours of sleep and gas station sushi, but that doesn't make it ideal. Now, let's talk about the food pyramid's modern replacement. Nutrition science didn't stop evolving in 1992. We now understand the importance of fiber, gut health, metabolic flexibility, and food quality over rigid macronutrient ratios. Modern dietary guidance emphasizes whole foods, protein diversity, fruits, vegetables, legumes, and minimizing ultra processed foods. The pyramid quietly disappeared because it couldn't be updated without admitting it was incomplete. So that's when RFK Jr.'s new guidelines come in, less emphasis on refined grains and more emphasis on whole foods, metabolic health, and chronic disease prevention. That doesn't mean that they're perfect because they're not, but it does mean that the conversation has shifted. So here's another part of this conversation that almost nobody wants to touch because it breaks the illusion that this is all about personal choice. Our food system cannot support everyone eating the way nutrition guidelines tell us to eat. Not even close. If every American decided tomorrow to eat mostly whole foods, fresh vegetables, fruits, and minimally processed grains and quality proteins, the system would not adapt. It would collapse. And I don't mean philosophically, I mean physically, logistically, and economically. The modern food supply is not designed around health, it's designed around scale, shelf life, efficiency, and profit. Ultra processed foods exist because they are cheap to manufacture, easy to transport, easy to store, and predictable. They don't spoil quickly. They don't require seasonal planning. They don't depend on local infrastructure. They can just sit in a warehouse for months and still be sold as food. Fresh food doesn't work that way. Produce spoils. Whole foods require labor. They require refrigeration, distribution networks, skilled laborers, and constant replenishment. They cost more to move, they cost more to waste, and waste is built into the system. Grocery stores expect spoilage, farmers expect loss. The system is designed to absorb that inefficiency by pushing people towards food that doesn't rot. This is why ultra processed food dominates shelf space. This is why entire aisles exist for snacks, boxed meals, frozen dinners, and shelf stable products, while fresh food is crammed around the perimeter. This isn't a coincidence. This is optimization. So, when public health messaging tells us to just eat better, it ignores the reality that the environment is actively pushing us in the opposite direction. It's cheaper to buy calories than it is to buy nutrients. It's easier to buy convenience than freshness. And it's not that people are lazy or ignorant, it's because the system makes one choice easy and the other one hard. And here's the uncomfortable part. If the demand for ultra processed food dropped sharply, we don't currently have the infrastructure to replace it with whole food at scale. We don't grow enough diverse produce. We don't have enough regional processing facilities. We don't have enough distribution networks that prioritize nutrition over efficiency. The system is extremely fragile because it was never meant to nourish optimally. It was meant to feed cheaply and consistently. This is also why nutrition guidelines stay vague. Clear guidance would expose a problem no one wants to solve. If a guideline told us most of your calories should come from fresh, minimally processed foods, the next question would be, okay, well, how do we make that accessible to everyone? And that question leads directly to subsidies, land use, labor, pricing, and corporate power. These are not nutrition questions, these are economic questions, and they're expensive ones. So instead, we get advice that technically points us in the right direction, but stops short of demanding systemic change. Eat more vegetables, choose whole grains, limit processed foods. All true, all correct, and all impossible to fully implement without changing how food is produced, distributed, and sold. This is why guilt based nutrition messaging doesn't work. Telling people they're failing just because they didn't meal prep, didn't cook from scratch, or didn't perfectly shop ignores the reality that many people are navigating time scarcity, financial pressure, and constant marketing designed to override their decision making. You cannot individual willpower your way out of a structural problem. And this is why every new pyramid, plate, or guideline ends up feeling disconnected from real life. The science improves, the graphics improve, the messaging gets cleaner, but the system underneath never changes. So behavior doesn't change either. Until food policy addresses subsidies, processing incentives, marketing, and access, not just nutrients and portions, nutrition advice will always be aspirational instead of practical. It will describe a world that technically could exist, but doesn't. And that might be the most honest explanation for why we keep cycling through pyramids, plates, and rebrands while chronic disease rates continue to rise. We keep updating the advice without fixing the environment that following it makes it nearly impossible. That's not a failure of individuals, that's a failure of the system. So, at the end of the day, the problem was never the shape of the food pyramid. It wasn't the triangle. It wasn't even the recommendations themselves in isolation. The problem was taking simplified guidance and dropping it into a system designed to exploit simplicity. Big bread didn't need to corrupt the pyramid. They benefited from it being vague. Big dairy didn't need to invent science. They amped selective science. The meat lobby didn't deny health risks. They softened the language. Everyone played the game within the rules, and the public absorbed the consequences. And that's why every new food pyramid, plate, or guideline will always be incomplete unless it addresses ultra processing, marketing, subsidies, and food access directly. Because nutrition advice doesn't exist in a plate or a pyramid, it exists in a grocery store. So, was the food pyramid a conspiracy? Not in the Hollywood sense, but it was absolutely shaped by lobbying, subsidies, economic pressure, and institutional conflicts of interest. And when public health guidance is filtered through profit incentives, even small compromises can have massive consequences over time. The real takeaway here isn't that bread is bad, milk is poison, or meat is killing you. The real takeaway is that ultra processed food hijacked vague guidelines and we paid the price. The pyramid didn't fail because humans are stupid, it failed because corporations are efficient. So, this is what I have to say: eat real food, don't fear carbs, don't worship protein, don't demonize fat. Move your body, get sunlight, and maybe be a little skeptical when nutrition advice just so happens to perfectly align with billion-dollar industries. Because history tells us something that's very important. When food guidelines make someone incredibly rich, your health probably wasn't the main priority. So, to recap, the food pyramid wasn't evil, it was just vague, compromised, and absolutely dunked on by capitalism. Carbs aren't the enemy, dairy is optional, meat is delicious but not mandatory, and ultra processed food is the real final boss. So, eat real food when you can, question everything, and don't take nutrition advice from a cereal mascot wearing sunglasses. Oh, and before we go, I officially bequeath a name to the listeners of this podcast. You are now legally and spiritually part of the Pick Pack. There will be no discussion, and this decision was final. So, to those in the Pick Pack that made it to the end, congratulations. You are now skeptical of everything. I have been Nick. This has been the Nick Pick, and I'll see you next time, assuming Big Bread doesn't silence me first. Hey guys, thanks for listening to The Nick Pick, the podcast equivalent of Googling random things at 3 a.m. that you definitely didn't need to know. Stay tuned for more topics that literally nobody asked for, and don't forget to follow me on Instagram and X at The Nick Pick Pod.